the fair election process will lead to a more balanced and well-represented people. So I just want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you for my partner and my opposition. But let's get into the resolution. So we're here to debate the U.S. federal government should enact campaign finance reform. Observation 1, resolutional analysis. The affirmative reserves the right to define. And we define this as a policy debate. We define it as that because should implies action, and so we're going to give you an action today. Terms, we're going to define U.S. federal government as Congress, and then campaign finance reform as public and equal financing of elections. That leads me to our plan text, that the Congress will pass a constitutional amendment that will state that all elections will be publicly funded like they have in UK, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, and Canada. And then our criterion today is going to be net benefits, because if it's the most good for the most amount of people. So observation 2, harms. Right now, Congress and senators and the president all spend about 3/4 of their time fundraising. That's 3/4 of their time not helping the American people, not using their time to be productive and actually contribute to America. All they are doing is trying to get money from rich lobbyists. This leads to lobbyists having a disproportionate amount of power. They have so much sway in politics because politicians rely on them so they can keep power and keep winning elections. This will lead me right into observation 3, my advantages, prioritizing individuals. Right now, lobbyists are prioritized over the American people. This won't change because politicians rely too much on the money. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars to run a campaign. Money you can't get from the average American, who right now we're in a recession. Not everybody has enough money to contribute to who they think will be elected. So that means that corporations and big money, rich people will have way too much influence over politicians, and right now politicians have to take that money if they want to stay in power, because we all know politicians love their jobs. And so impacts. This will lead to constituents are more prioritized. We'll have a stronger voice in politics. What the American people want will actually get done, as opposed to what rich people want, like we have it now. Observation 4, advantage 2, political diversity. Right now, we don't have that much competition in Congress. You pretty much can be only 2 of the major parties. You can be a Republican or you can be a Democrat. There are 2 independent senators, I believe, but they don't really have, they're pretty much Democrats anyway. Right now, independent parties such as the Green Party and everything, they don't have any power and they can't represent people who have different opinions. Do we really think there's only 2 ways of thinking in America? Which will lead, if once we enact campaign finance reform, it will lead to more accurate representation. So if a Californian believes in something, I can elect the California party as opposed to having somebody who has to rely on money from the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee. And then advantage 3, decreased time in office. Right now, we have career senators and politicians. Politicians just stay in office for 30, 40 years. And this is because the longer they stay in office, the easier it is to keep power and the less they have to do. So if I'm in office for 30 years, I already know which corporations are going to back me, who's going to be funding me. I have a war chest of money prepared for the elections. And that means that new people who are just trying to get into politics or who feel like they can represent the state or a county better are at a huge disadvantage right at the start. This isn't fair. They're not. They can't really influence anything in America, and but with the campaign finance reform, you won't. Politicians will have equal footing, and they will have a fair and balanced system where everybody has the same chance of getting elected. Because right now, if you have money, you get in. If you don't have money, you don't get in. And a publicly financed elections will fix all that. So just to repeat myself, I'm going to go over our plan text, which is through a majority vote, Congress is going to pass a constitutional amendment to publicly fund elections. Do you have any questions or concerns about that? Or need any sort of clarification? Okay. So then the advantages to this are prioritizing individuals, more competition and political diversity, and then decreased time in office. Thank you. So you don't really get a chance to talk right now, so you kind of just have to get up and start going.
Like you can whisper a few things as you're getting up on your way to the podium.
Okay.
Since it's your first time, if you want to take a few seconds, go for it. But generally, you have to get right up and speak.
Yeah, so for some reason, we're not allowed to take pens up there.
Yeah.
I'll probably be shorter than what it is for you. Okay. Do I need to introduce myself? Just like.
However you want to do it.
Okay.
Generally, it's just thank yous to everyone, and then you get into it.
My name is Katie, and I'd like to thank the judges for being here and my partner. First of all, I'm going to argue that my opposing partner said that prioritizing individuals would help. I'm losing what I'm saying. Sorry, guys. Totally forgot what I was just going to say.
No worries.
Okay, I'm here to argue that politics is inherently corrupt. My partner said that prioritizing individuals would guys, I'm losing it. I can't do this.
Just take some time, collect your thoughts, and then say stuff.
So my opposing partner argued that prioritizing individuals, like they do in Mexico, Japan, and the UK, would I'm just stuck. Totally stuck.
Go on to maybe the next thing that he said.
Next thing, okay. It's more diversity. My notes are like really scattered.
What about what did you prepare before the round?
Do you want to go first?
Can you switch?
Can we
like,
switch? Like
halfway
how
through
you
that?
did?
Sure.
I'm really sorry, guys.
No worries.
I'm just like losing my train of thought.
That's cool.
In a real debate, you couldn't switch, but
Right.
This isn't real, so who gives
Yeah.
a shit?
It's practice. You practice like you play, or you to the closest extent possible.
The first track.
No, I won't have a pen up here.
Good.
I'm just not want to bring a pen up here, you said?
Yeah.
That's kind of random, but okay. Well, my name is Aaliyah King, and I'd like to thank all of you for being here, and all of you who are going to watch this video later on, or just listening to our ramblings. And I'd like to thank my opponents for starting off this debate. I am obviously going for the neg on that the U.S. federal government should not enact um, campaign finance reform. My opponent brought up some interesting topics. He did reiterate a few times that right now we are in a government where we prioritize lobbyists over individuals, and through his solution of equally funding public finance, we would be able to prioritize individualism more, and we would be able to give us stronger voices. However, there was a little lack of clarity as to how that would be necessarily achieved, and I don't necessarily agree with that. I honestly believe that there is no solvency when it comes to enacting campaign reform because politics is inherently corrupt. No matter which nation that you look at, even if we're just walking away from the United States, if we look at Japan, if we look at the UK, New Zealand, Mexico, all these nations that my opponent mentioned earlier when he was saying that we should try and emulate our national government to be more like them, they're all corrupt regardless. So it's hard to essentially just say that we should be like other governments because obviously they have problems as well. And if their plan doesn't ban politics, which their plan doesn't, their plan is just to emulate other politics that we've seen throughout the world, then there obviously is no solvency because there's no way that you can ever have politics be less corrupt. You can try and say that you will include political diversity and by decreasing time in office that things will get accomplished, but honestly, there's no way to prove that any of these factors will ever happen. So for those reasons, obviously, you should enact campaign finance reform. However, just to touch upon what my opponent said earlier, he did say that decreasing time in office would help because then because a lot of people believe that if you spend more time in office, that you're just honestly there because you know, like my partner said, like you know who's going to be able to support you financially, you know who's going to work for you, and you're going to be able to keep your salary, but you're not actually accomplishing anything. But honestly, by bringing in all those new opponents, not those new opponents, but all the new workers that my opponent was mentioning, would not really help the situation at all. Because by bringing in a lot of new employees, we just waste time by teaching them new techniques on what is going on there. And that just, like I said, is a waste of time. So that's obviously another thing that goes against. He said that we spend 3/4 of our time fundraising with rich lobbyists. However, if we have to spend that much time training new employees, then how effective is their plan really going to be? Additionally, another reason as to why we really should not enact campaign finance reform is because people are just now getting used to Citizens United ruling that we have had. Their plan is significantly different from anything that the U.S. has ever seen. We've never done public funding. We never raised public funds specifically for this. We've asked for donations from the two political parties, like, hey, at the end of the year, maybe you want to donate $1 to each political party, because that way, hey, they would have the same amount. But honestly, we've never done anything as what Nicole was saying. We're just going to support anyone who wants to run and give them equally funded money. We've never done that before. So that would be a really big difference from anything that we've seen in our nation so far. And it takes time for people to learn. As I said, we're just getting used to our Citizens ruling Citizens United's ruling, that we've had. And that's been approximately 10 years to just achieve that equilibrium, to learn the ins and outs, all the rules and regulations, how much we can and cannot allow super PACs to donate. All those things have taken 10 years. So just by enacting their new plan would cause an entire system shock to the nation and to our federal government that will harm us more than help us. Additionally, the impact of this system shock is going to be that those who are wealthier, those who have more money, will have greater access to politicians, which they already do now. So how much is it really going to change there? Because if they have more money and they have more wealth, they will have better access to lawyers, and people who just have more money, they just are able to put in, people who have more money, there's a saying in politics, I don't know if any of you have ever heard it, but it's essentially that money in politics is like water in cracks, or it's like water in the sidewalk. No matter what, it's always going to seep through. So stuff like that, like that's clearly an example of just no matter what you do, no matter how much you try and change campaign finance, you're never going to really solve the problem. Money will always find a way to seep into the cracks. No matter what happens, that's going to occur. And that's all I really have to say on the topic, and I really appreciate you guys here for all your time. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everybody for being here, the opposition team, my partner on the government. We think we have a really great plan, and here's why. So our thesis this round is that we think transparency and equal funding provides a much fairer system of elections and representation, and so that's why we're providing campaign finance reform in the form of publicly funded elections. So first I'm going to go off case and respond to what the opposition has brought up. So first they said they're against campaign finance reform. And that wasn't necessarily an argument, but I just want to make a response here, which is that when you look at the harms of what's happening that my partner Spencer brought up, is that when 3/4 of a congressperson's time is spent fundraising, that's a huge harm. So to say that you're against campaign finance reform means that you're essentially in agreement with that being a good thing. We're saying, no, let's try to reform that, let's try to change it. So on to their second argument they made, which was sort of like vagueness. They were saying like, well, there was a lack of clarity with our plan. So I'll just take a moment to clarify. So my partner Spencer brought up how we're going to be following the models. We're going to enact a constitutional amendment for publicly funded elections that follows the model of European countries like UK, Canada, and elsewhere. And so essentially what this is, it means that every candidate who's running for a certain position will get the same amount of money. It's really very clear cut. It's not a complicated policy. So hopefully that clears things up. Their third argument was that politics is inherently corrupt. And my first response is no, it isn't. It's money and congresspeople being in there for 30 years at a time that makes it corrupt. And also, they brought up how it was even in other countries, any political system, it's all corrupt. But ours is the most corrupt, and we can tell by looking at Congress's approval ratings. They're very low, at all-time lows in this country, meandering at around 13% to 15%, which is very low. A lot lower than the UK, a lot lower than Mexico, a lot lower than Canada, a lot lower than Australia. So our politics seem to be a lot more corrupt than any other countries, which is why we're saying, let's look at what they're doing to have their citizens actually approve of them more, and let's follow that model. Their fourth point was that they said you can't make politics less corrupt. And I'm just going to say you absolutely can, and here's an example. The Hatch Act that was passed in the late 1800s decreased nepotism in the government by a lot. What was happening was, if you were appointed to a position of power, you were able to appoint family members, friends, other acquaintances that you wanted to promote into a position of power, and that wasn't against the law, and that was totally cool. What happened was the people saw that, and they were like, we disapprove of this, and we think that that's corrupt. Then the government passed what's known as the Hatch Act, which says, okay, now you have to put people in positions based on merit, not based on your relationship to them. So I think the Hatch Act is a really good example of government actually becoming less corrupt. Their fifth argument was, they said that because we're sort of enforcing informal term limits, meaning people aren't going to be in office as long, that it's going to waste times with all these new political representatives trying to learn the system. So my first response is that they already know how Congress works. People running for politics know what they're getting into, and they know how Congress works. You learn it in elementary school, you learn it in middle school, you learn it in high school, you learn it in college. And most, if not all, of the candidates who run for office have attended college. The second is that it's not a steep learning curve. I've never heard a congressperson or any political commentator say, well, this congressman just needs time to learn how it works so that they know how bills are passed. No, I mean, the fact is, most of us probably remember the Schoolhouse Rock song, I'm just a bill and I'm on Capitol Hill, and it's really that simple. There really isn't a steep learning curve. So it's not going to be wasting time. And my next response too is that even if it is, it's worth it to decrease corruption and increase fairness. Their next argument, what I have down as their sixth argument, was that, well, we've never done public funding in the US before, and so therefore it's going to be this massive roadblock. So I have 4 responses for this. The first one is that we do public funding all the time. For example, schools. The next response, like public funding for schools. Yeah, there are private schools, but we have a publicly funded school system that works well too. The second response is we do it with technologies, where there's public funding for certain technologies. For example, in Obama's first term, one of the first things he did was he wanted to put money into alternative resources. And so he funded a company called Solyndra that does solar power. I'm not saying whether or not that was the right decision, I'm just saying we've done public funding before. My third response is it's just not that difficult to have public funding. It's as simple as passing a constitutional amendment and then corporations don't contribute candidates. My fourth response is that there are models elsewhere for us to learn from. The UK didn't have stumbling blocks. Canada didn't have stumbling blocks. Mexico didn't even have stumbling blocks with their public funding of elections. So there are models elsewhere that we can follow. Their next argument was one of system shock. And this one actually had an impact, that the wealthy would have more access. But then they also said that the wealthy already do have a lot of access. So my first response is then that doesn't change anything. That's not much of an impact if nothing worse happens than what's already happening. And my second response is this system shock didn't happen elsewhere. UK, Australia, Canada, even more examples, Israel, Mexico, Australia, if I may have already said that, but that there was no system shock in those countries. So there's no reason to believe that we would have a system shock in this country. And they said that money in politics is like water in the cracks. It's always going to find a way in. And my response is that may be true, but at least we do something to make it illegal, and then they can be prosecuted for doing that. Whereas now it's just willy-nilly contribute all the money you'd like. So we will actually be enacting legislation to solve that. So now let me get into our case and really talk about the solvency points here. So our first one is of popular sovereignty, and it basically like power to the people, right? That we're supposed to be a government that's ruled by the people, but what we've seen with our current political system is that it's really an oligarchy, that it's really a select few, mostly the rich, who are determined what policy decisions are made. And so with our public funding of campaigns, that doesn't happen, and you're not going to have big banks contributing to these campaigns. Our example would be like the way it works now is Eric Cantor was Senate Minority Leader, and he's not elected again. What does he do? He gets hired at Goldman Sachs. They basically own him, meaning like, okay, if you're not going to work in Congress for us, you're going to work for us against Congress. And so we're saying, look, power should be to the people, not Goldman Sachs, not Eric Cantor, not those politicians that have been there the longest. Second advantage of political diversity, we should have an accurate representation of the demographic, not like 85% white males representing everybody. It's just not the way to go. And our third advantage, it decreases time in office, meaning we're getting fresh faces in that are going to be able to really work and care about their jobs because they don't already have a huge fundraising base where they can sit back and do nothing and win elections. So with that in mind, I urge a vote for government. Thank you.
Okay, so do I introduce myself or do I just go right off?
Usually just a thank yous and then get into it.
I thank the judges for being here, my opposing partners, and the opposing team and my partner. First off, the opposing team said that public funding, public funding within the school. We should do public funding by doing public funding within the schools, public funding through technology. Yes, public funding would be a good way to create more money, but as the poverty line increases, we are not going to be able to get as much money from people as we have in the past. It's not difficult for public funding. Once again, it will be difficult as the poverty line increases. My opposing partner argued that we should eliminate corruption, but I like to state where there's politics, there will always be corruption. The opposing partner argued that we should have a popular solvency, a government ruled by its people, accurate demographic representation, incorporating more minorities into government. We already have done this. Our president right now is African American, and we've already incorporated minorities into the government. The opposing partner failed to mention where all the money for this will come from. The PM stated that we are in a recession. Yes, we are in a recession, but where is all this money coming from? The opposing partner also said we're more corrupt. This is possible, however, they're still corrupt. You cannot fully eliminate corruption. For example, in Switzerland, they still use Nazi money to back their government, and in Japan, they use bribes. If this is not inherently corrupt, then I don't know what this is. So I would like to wrap this up by saying losing solvency means you lose the round. There is no such theory as a minor repair, and therefore politics are inherently corrupt, and totally lost my conclusion, guys, but I'm done. I felt like I was rambling. That was horrible.
No, that was good. Oh yeah, stop.